Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to Red Light Exposé podcast. This episode is part of our Men for Equality series, where we highlight the voices of 8 men who are doing important work that supports the movement to end commercial sexual exploitation. These men are survivor activists, policy advisors, and passionate changemakers. Red Light Exposé thanks EmpowerMen for their generosity in helping to make this series possible. You can check out and support the great work they are doing on their website, empowermen.ca. And now to the episode.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Red Light Exposé. My name is Andrea Heinz. I am one of the hosts here. I spent 7 years in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada's licensed and regulated commercial sex industry. I'm very passionate about commercial sexual exploitation, and I'm very happy to be a part of this project. I'm happy to be here today doing episode 1 of our summer series, which we are running for the months of July and August, sponsored by EmpowerMen out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And today I have the fortune of interviewing the sponsor for this series, who is my dear friend, Hennes Doltze. Hennes Doltze leads the EmpowerMen project, which is part of the Mama We Center in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. His team engages men and boys to prevent sexual exploitation and sex trafficking through awareness, training, research, and relationship building, highlighting that men create most of the demand for sexual exploitation, yet very little attention is focused on their involvement and their impact. Hennes has worked with hundreds of men on issues of relationships, addressing domestic violence and commercial sexual exploitation. He holds a degree in social work and nonprofit management and has worked in different positions in the mental health field, child welfare, and the criminal justice system. Hennes is passionate about men playing a more active role in creating safer communities for women and girls. He regularly presents at trainings for law enforcement, social services, and educators on human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and healthy masculinity. Welcome, Hennes. We're really happy that you could be here today to share your knowledge and your insights.
Hi, Andrea. It's really nice to see you and to hear you, and it's a pleasure to be in the space with you here today. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by saying that I consider you a really dear friend, and I have really enjoyed getting to know you over the last 5 years or so. I think I remember first hearing about you when someone said, there's this guy, he's super amazing, and he's out of Winnipeg, and he's kind of got his hands in everything. Like, he's behind the scenes. You may not have met him, but you really need to. He's quite fantastic. And then next I knew it was during COVID when Defend Dignity had their summit. And I see you emceeing the entire multi-day summit. And I'm like, okay, yeah, it is true what everyone said about him. He's quite committed and eager. It was a ton of presentations. Since then, I've just watched you really do a lot of incredible work. And I've been really appreciative of the support that you've given to me in particular and my co-author, Kathy King, through supporting our book launch, which was in November of 2024 here in Edmonton, Alberta, supporting us with getting some book sales, distributing those books throughout some areas in Manitoba and beyond, inviting us to speaking opportunities, and now sponsoring our Men for Equality summer series. And I just want to say, I feel like your bio doesn't do you justice because I don't think it adequately captures the relational component that is crucial to all this work, which you really excel in my opinion. You know, you've really helped move a lot of people's targeted goals forward and really the entire movement as a result. So I just want to start by saying thanks for all that you do.
Well, thank you for the acknowledgement and thank you for the kind words. It's a pleasure to work with you and many others in this field. And I appreciate your dedication to this topic, your activism in that space, particularly with you and Kathy authoring the book, which fits very much into the conversations that we want to have with men. So I'm happy and pleased that this is possible, that you and I and a number of others can work together, and happy to sponsor this summer series because I believe the more attention we can bring to this issue and the more conversations we can have in the public space, both with men and women, is really helpful. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you for such kind comments. That's high praise in my eyes. So thank you. So there's a few things I obviously want to pick your brain on and touch on, but I think in order to contextualize that and really get a sense of the work that you're doing now and the challenges that we're seeing in the Canadian climate and kind of getting your thoughts on all of that, I think a good place to start really is to go back in time and look at your upbringing, because listeners might not pick up on your accent, but you're from Germany and spent the first 20 years of your life living there. We always discuss nature versus nurture when we talk about offenders, but we don't really do that when we talk about the men who are pro-social and pro-equality. And I think it's just as important to do that and look at what things act as protective factors as well as considering those risk factors. So, how did you grow up in Germany amid this sex positive culture there, arguably the most rampant one that we see in the world, and turn out as you did, and not, as I would assume, some of your age mates or your peers did who possibly became involved in the commercial sex industry as consumers? If you could just give us some background about your earlier life in Germany, that would be, I think, a good place to start.
Yeah, that's a good question. So as you mentioned, I grew up in Germany in a very stable home, a two-parent household. I have two siblings. They're both older than me, a sister and a brother. And growing up in Germany, I didn't really pay close attention to this topic of prostitution, sexual exploitation, etc. Maybe my first contact with that topic was around when I was like in my teenage years, so maybe 15, 16. And I remember in my hometown where I grew up, a city called Dresden, they used to have this erotic convention, like where you have a whole bunch of different exhibitors, as they call themselves, very pro-prostitution, pro-sex work exhibitors and discussions. And I remember seeing the advertisements for that and was on one hand a little bit curious as a young man, obviously, but also a bit disgusted at the same thing, because I always felt like, why does this need to be so publicly displayed and showcased? There was a weird thing to see. And growing up in Germany, which is, like you said, it's a very liberal culture when it comes to sexuality, but also the public display of it, right? Like you have brothels that are very publicly advertised. It's not hidden. You can identify these establishments. You have billboards with mostly women that are almost naked or very little clothing on. It was just normalized in some ways. But I always had a sort of a sense of, how are people living in these spaces? How are women that are in prostitution? Why do they get into that? Another thing that I remember was because the town that I grew up in was very close to the Czech borders. There was always these trailers along one of the main highways that would go into the Czech Republic where women were working out of, so to speak, or being exploited out of, like in the sex trade. And it was always weird why somebody would live this kind of life. But I didn't really think about it that much at that time and didn't really pay too much attention to that. When it comes to the work that I'm doing now, I didn't really start out doing this kind of work, but it was much more focused on working in the social work field related to the criminal justice system. So always with somebody who had some run-ins with the law or was imprisoned. During my university degree, I was part of an organization that would go and visit prisoners, try to reestablish contact between inside and outside of prison and help them reintegrate. So I've always, in some ways, had a weird fascination with people who were struggling, who were involved with the law and trying to understand these kinds of things. I think part of what inspired me to work in the social work field in the first place was a sense of calling, and part of it has to do with my personal faith, but also part of it was we as a society, particularly in Germany, is a very wealthy, rich, organized society for the most part. And yet you have people that are poor, that are struggling, that are committing some sort of crime, but that are also traumatized. And so you have this mix together. And I always felt in a sense of wanting to make a difference, however big or small that may have been. And that's part of the reason why I went into social work, to try and be part of the solution and work towards a sense of justice and a sense of restoration for people that were struggling. But in my first couple of years of my career, that whole issue of sexual exploitation and trafficking wasn't really on my radar. It came really only into my consciousness when I was starting to work here in Winnipeg, running the domestic violence program, as well as what we would call the John School, even though I'm not a big fan of this name anymore, for men who had been arrested for purchasing sex. And that was really the big entry for me to dive into the topic of sexual exploitation and to prostitution, human trafficking, and listening to stories of survivors and their experiences, also their reasons why they were involved in the sex industry. And for the most part, it wasn't because they were so excited to be there or they were looking forward to this, but it was out of that sense of struggle, out of poverty, or having grown up in a home that wasn't very stable and maybe parents weren't around, or other events like abuse, etc. And I think listening to the stories of the survivors, I think that really opened my eyes to all of these kinds of things. And I was like, how is that possible that we live in a world where this is acceptable and where people sell their bodies to make money and just to be able to have the bare necessities of life, right? Like to be able to pay their rent or their food or support their children or those kinds of things. That didn't feel right to me. I feel like people shouldn't be subjected to that level of exploitation when there should be other things. Obviously, part of it is influenced also to my view of relationship sexuality. I don't think it's good or healthy for individuals or society to commodify these kinds of things, right? And to say, well, if you don't have any other way of making money, this is one option, right? To sleep with 10, 20, or however more men every day and be subjected to these strangers that you don't know. That was my start into this, just having that sense. There's a lot of women, there's men as well in the sex trade, but it's overwhelmingly women, right? And then I started to look at, okay, so who are all of these men that go to these women? Why are they doing that? What's driving them to be involved in that?
Yeah, that's a question that we never really ask.
And that's a little bit my critique is in our public debates, we're so focused on why does somebody get involved in the sex trade or in the sex industry as a seller, so to speak, but we hardly ever talk about the demand side. And I think it's a huge lack in not only understanding it, but also holding people accountable in some ways and understanding the dynamics. Working in the prostitution offender program, I think really helped my understanding and my learning about these dynamics, as well as the connection to commercial sexual exploitation, to human trafficking, who benefits from it, what's the market like. And I find the demand side is often kept in the shadows, maybe intentionally, that we don't make it about men. We don't make it about men that buy sex or that are the demand. Our attention is focused on the women, whether they want to be there, whether they should be there, is it a choice, etc. All of these big discussions. And my hope is that through the work that we're doing here is that we can focus much more on the demand side, because when you look at it, there's huge numbers, and you reference some of those numbers in the book, right? Like where you look at individual cities, then provinces, and then as a country of Canada, what's the market size? And it's hard to find accurate numbers, but we have to talk about much more about that group that is responsible, and that is obviously men. It's still a highly gendered issue. I know that there's women as well, but it is overwhelmingly men.
Yeah. And oftentimes, too, I think that when women do offend, when they do come through prostitution offender programs, they're oftentimes operating or offending in conjunction with a male offender. You know, I've had now just over 12 years of involvement in our John School here in Edmonton, and I think in all the years that it's existed, I could be a little bit off because I obviously wasn't back there in 1996 when the program began. But from my recollection of what I've heard, there's only ever been 2 women that have come through the program. And in both these situations, or all these situations, from what I gather, it was street exploitation. But you're right, it's very highly gendered. And I think that speaks to why we have to really shine a light on men's socialization as well as their decisions in light of that to really move this needle forward and see some change in this area. We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
I'm not surprised about the numbers that you talked about for Edmonton. When I was in the program, so I ran it here in Winnipeg for about 7 years. And I remember that there was one woman that was referred. She never came into the program for whatever reason, but she was the only one within 7 years. The rest was all males that were arrested and then sent to the program. When you look at official statistics, that is in line with what you and I have seen on the ground in these programs. And so the question is then, obviously, it's a gendered issue. It's mostly males. And then how do we explore that, the reasons why, what are the drivers for men to decide on that? And those are huge cultural, I think, dynamics as well as personal dynamics. But unless we start talking about that and unless we start putting a light on that, I think we're always missing part of the conversation. Whether we talk about trafficking or sex trafficking and exploitation, even if we just talk about the sex industry without any pimp or trafficker involvement, we still have the demand side, which is always there.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it. I think it was a survivor. She said, there isn't always a pimp or a trafficker, but there is always a buyer.
Correct.
Yeah. And it's really odd that, like you said, there's no light shone on them really in any kind of way. And I think that's why we really like the name of our podcast, right? Like Red Light Exposé. We're shining a light on the on these things because, yeah, there's so much. I don't want to say it's willful ignorance, but maybe it is because the information is there and people just don't seem to fall into the area of wanting to learn about this, or maybe it's just kind of too taboo or standoffish. I don't know what the word is, but it makes people uncomfortable to talk about these things is what I've really learned. But what I come to realize in my time in the sex trade offender program here is that men are really appreciative of the conversation and of the information. And of course, there's always a few that say, I shouldn't be here, or this is work. But that's usually just at the beginning of the 8-hour program. And the transformation I've seen, it's really hard whenever I see people say these programs don't work or men don't deserve a second chance or it's a slap on the wrist, because I really haven't seen any major transformation in people like I've seen in those programs with every single class that we've done. So I guess I want to know more about how that time with you running the prostitution offender program, like what were some of the personal impacts that it had on you as an individual, and what were some of the things that you noticed maybe about the program, like in regards to its effectiveness or any shortcomings? And I guess ultimately, how did that time go on to influence your work now?
So I came into this position in 2013. And like I said, I ran it for about 7 years, so until 2020. I knew the program because I had done my social work field placement in the same organization, which here in Winnipeg, it's run by the Salvation Army. So I knew the program. I remember the first year or so was still an odd kind of topic for me because it was related to sex, to sexuality, to very personal topics. And certainly in my social work degree or in my studies, it wasn't really an issue or wasn't really talked about, even in the curriculum for social work. So there was a lot of learning and a big learning curve for me for the first year and a half. And just trying to understand not only the issues, but when we would receive a referral and then I would meet with a guy, I'm in charge now of trying to challenge his thinking about these kinds of things, but at the same time also offer a level of support and understanding and trying to be in this balance between holding somebody accountable while, and because there was a referral that was done by the police with the approval of the Crown, but then also helping men understand their own issues a little bit more, right? And so I think in the first year, what I noticed was, like I said earlier, I think just learning from women, from survivors of exploitation about their stories and making it very real. I think that was the big part. And then for those who are not familiar with the prostitution offender program, there's usually an intake meeting after referral, and then there's a full-day workshop seminar with different people that come in from either in a professional setting or as a personal experience that they share that with the group. So this would be police officers, a Crown attorney, sometimes from a nurse, the survivors. We always had tried to have a former participant in the program as well, because I think that's always an important aspect too. to let somebody speak about their experience who was at one point sitting in the seat of one of the participants. And when men come in, I mean, there's the sense of dread, there's the sense of, feeling this level of shame and feeling this level of exposure, which I think in some ways is good, because I think that part of bringing it out of the shadows, right? And maybe this was often the first time that they had to talk about this, right? They were arrested, their car was impounded. Sometimes the car was registered in the wife's or partner's name. So they had to explain to their partner, why is the car not there? Why do you have to be at this group on Saturday? And I think for some men, this was something that they dreaded to come, right? Because they've been exposed, they've been arrested.
Yeah.
And for others, it was like being annoyed or angry for the arrest. And for others, it was a sense of relief almost. I remember this one guy, and he says, you know what? I've been doing this for so many years, and internally, I knew that I would have to stop or not continue. I just didn't know how. So he got arrested, he got referred to us, and he says, this is actually, despite being the arrest, being uncomfortable, etc., he says, I actually needed that because it was almost like somebody from the outside needed to force him to rethink and re-examine his own behavior. And then I think throughout the day when we did the workshops, we were really trying to not just provide information and the education about, the realities of the sex trade, why women get in, what are the legal consequences, what are the consequences for the men, for their well-being, etc. So we always try to keep it balanced and address the issue from different angles, but also at least starting that conversation with the men of, what's your own personal reason for this, right? Like, what drives you to this? Is it just the sex? What are some of those internal factors? And obviously that's a huge conversation. And in some ways, the setup of the John School program is such that it doesn't allow for those longer conversations. It is education focused, and I think it's valuable. And I have seen men change as well, and particularly hearing those stories from survivors and sometimes seeing the raw emotion that those women still carry with them because of their experiences. I think it forced the men to acknowledge that this woman, she isn't just a sex trade worker, so to speak, or somebody, or a prostitute in their opinion, right? I wouldn't really use those terms, but that's how the men see them. But that it's actually a person that has a story, that has a history, that has sometimes endured pretty horrific things, both as a child, and often it starts as a young person that people get sucked into it. And I think just having this story of a real person in front of them, rather than somebody that they can objectify and just see through a sexual lens, that was always very impactful. And I think having conversations with men about, how does this impact? This is not just between you and her. There's many more people that are impacted, your kids, the whole community. We would always have somebody from a community background that would talk about the implications of the drug trade that is often connected, sometimes the gangs that are controlling some of those women, etc. So I think really putting that in that context and sharing that information is important for the men. And what it did to me in some ways was it really helped me to put this in a larger context as well. And I remember also we would have somebody, a community activist, and she would talk about the issue of sexual exploitation and the connection to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And this was way before the conversations were happening on a larger societal or national level with the missing and murdered inquiry. We would have that woman, Candace was her name, and she would talk about some of the young women that were lost here in Winnipeg that were found outside of the city dead, and heartbreaking, horrific stories what these women had to endure. And I had heard her speak a couple of times, and it just felt so heavy every time to hear her speak. And yet I wonder, how does she do that? How does she come and talk to these men? And I was just so amazed by her willingness and that was her way of sharing that part of how this impacted her, one of her nieces was found as well. And it was just heart-wrenching. But I think those are the hard conversations that I think men need to hear, that there's so many more implications that all of these things have that I think men are just ignorant about, or they don't want to hear that. Maybe they have a sense of, not everybody is there by their own free will, and there's coercion, there's force, there's threats, etc. but I think it needs to be talked about, even if it gets uncomfortable. I think to your question is, are they effective? I think there's a level of effectiveness that you reach a certain amount of men with that, just with that information and having that level of education. So I do believe it's important to have that, even just for the fact that the police enforce the laws, and for those who do get arrested, that there is the sign that this is not okay. This is illegal. This is not okay. And at least here in Winnipeg and in some other cities, unfortunately not in many, police are willing to enforce it and to say buyers are absolutely part of this problem and need to be held accountable. I think that's important because it shows them that you can't get away with this here. This is not acceptable, and we as a community do not want to accept that.
Your anonymity will one day run out on you. You can't hide forever.
Exactly. And some people would say, why are we not publishing the names of people that get arrested or that get sent to John School? And I think it's a legitimate conversation. And I know it certainly happens in the US that I think there is sometimes public exposure. There's different sort of thoughts on, is that a good thing or not? But I think absolutely, if we want to make a difference, I think the enforcement part is certainly one aspect. I think that is important. I think where they could improve or where they fall short is just the amount of time that the men have to spend in the program. It's brief, it's intense, but it's brief. And I think for some guys who do indicate, yeah, you know what, now listening to all of these stories and seeing what the impact is and maybe starting that level of self-reflection, the window isn't very long sometimes. And then often the men just want to get past it, get the charges dealt with, and move on from it and put it in their past and put it back in the closet, so to speak. And so I think the expansion and the adjustment of these programs, I think it would benefit in a more deeper level to help men understand these issues, at least those who identify, yeah, this is an issue for me, and I want to work on that, because you will always have some people who just say, I got caught, I'm going through the program, and next time I'm just trying to not get caught anymore. You always have those as well, right? Who just see it as a way of avoiding any criminal proceeding through the justice system.
Mm-hmm.
But
just give me my stay of charges.
Yeah, but not really considering that this is maybe something that isn't really healthy for them, for themselves either, right? Like you have these very entrenched folks. So I think there could be improvements to the length and to the depth of the conversations, because I think in the end, men who do make changes usually do it because they've identified that this isn't really according to who they want to be or what values they want to have as a man. And I think we could reach more men if the program structure was changed in a more thorough way, you know. And I know that there's a couple of places in the US where they have done that. I think in Seattle. And ideally, I would like to see that here in Canada. I know that there's always a lot of different things to consider. Who approves that? It's runs through with the approval of the justice system. There's the financial aspect. There's the level of what are we requiring of men who are charged or referred to the program. So there's a lot of different considerations, but I think they are absolutely necessary, these programs, and I think they should be expanded. And one of the things that I don't really understand, I can't wrap my head around why some cities or some police agencies across Canada would not enforce the current prostitution laws in the first place. It puzzles me in some ways.
For our listeners, I'm sure some of you are tuning in for the first time, as well as others for repeated visits. So I know we've talked about Canadian prostitution laws on previous episodes, but if this is your first time hearing us, we'll maybe just give a quick rundown about our laws here in Canada. So since the end of 2014, we've had the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which is a partial decrim model, also sometimes known loosely as a Nordic model or abolitionist model or equality model or Swedish model. Has a few different names, but essentially what it does here in Canada is it makes exempt from prosecution those on the supply side of the encounter and then criminalizes the purchase of commercial sex acts. As Hennes said, unfortunately, we have a lot of areas in Canada that are it's most areas in Canada, really, I can safely say, that just really don't seem to see the value in this law or its promise, its potential. They just look at it like, why are you criminalizing one side of the transaction but not the other? There's really a lack of a understanding of how this is a form of male violence against women and girls primarily. and how this works to shrink market levels or degrees, if you will. Like it's a market constriction approach. And, it seems like in other countries like Sweden, France, the law seems to be taken a bit better, I guess, more well received. But I think that's probably because we're missing that public education component here in Canada, which is one of the key pillars to seeing success in the model. What are the main challenges that you see in our, maybe not just the law? Obviously, I think it's, we both agree our Nordic model style law is not adequately endorsed or enforced. But what are the larger issues that you see that maybe contribute to that being the case? Is there a degree of public apathy, or is it ignorance? Obviously, there's, our favorite topic to discuss lately, municipal licensing of brothels and escort agencies. I know that's an issue for us both. Media influence. There's so many, I think, influences that we could look at, but what are the kind of the key ones that you really think are taking the wheels off the car, so to speak?
Let me go back to the public education on PSEPA, and then I'll try and make this a little bit broader. I think that the issue with the enforcement part is not only that I think there's a lack of education for the general public. I think there's also a lack of education and really understanding not just the law itself, but the purpose of why the law was instituted amongst police officers, amongst people within the criminal justice system, crown attorneys, judges, etc. I think that connection and that public education within the justice system, I think, has not been consistent really across Canada. And I think that's a lag, because you can have the best laws on the books, but if you don't train people how to apply it, why it is the way it is, I think you're missing the ability to implement the law in a big way. And I think that's part of what I think needs to change is within the justice system. I still talk to police officers sometimes, and they say they don't have a clue of what the current prostitution laws are in Canada. And this is after 10 years or more than 10 years. And they're part of the criminal justice system. I think part of it is the issue that you have sometimes a very strong vocal group that are advocating for the fully decriminalized or legalized system, similar to how it is in Germany or in New Zealand and some other countries, who I think try to promote this under the illusion that legalizing will make it safer for women, right? Because their argument is always, if you criminalize even the buyers, you're forcing people underground, you're forcing people into unsafe conditions. The logic is flawed in that sense, because the issue doesn't just go away if you legalize it, because the violence and the harm that is caused more often than not by buyers or by pimps, that doesn't change all of a sudden, right?
Yeah, you can't legislate away misogyny.
No, exactly. And you can't legislate away or decriminalize like attitudes in a sense that all of a sudden you think men are not going to be harming, or buyers are not going to be harming women. And we know, I mean, there's survivors who say, I've been choked, I've had guns pulled at my head, et cetera, et cetera. It's significant. And people are under the impression that if you decriminalize it, all of this will go away. And I think that's a fallacy in the argument. I think part of it is also, I think we don't talk enough about the role of sexual violence as it comes to men, sexual exploitation, sexual violence. I think we still largely see it as a women's issue. We still talk about it as if men don't play a role in that. And I think we talk about gender-based violence, and what we really mean is domestic violence, sexual exploitation as a woman's issue. Whereas I think the issue is really, to a large degree, as a men's issue.
It is. And I just want to say, you never see people say child abuse is a children's issue.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a kid's issue. Why do we all of a sudden put that on women, right? This is your problem, your issue, that you're being victimized, that someone else is enacting these threats or these actions of harm against you, but that's your issue. It's not. And yeah, that really, I think, is a hot point that we need to shift away from in society, is considering it a women's issue.
And I mean, there's been so much work done over the last 30 or 40 years, particularly based on women's leadership with the shelter movement. And I think even the implementation of PSEPA in Canada goes back a lot to women's leadership in different organizations, having worked in institutions or organizations that support women that are exploited through the sex trade, et cetera. And I think those are really commendable things. And I think the next step that we need to take is to say, what is a men's role in all of these kinds of things? We should absolutely continue to support and to provide services and education on how we prevent victimization. but we should equally talk about how do we prevent perpetration. And again, perpetration is mostly done by men. So I think having a cultural shift or a cultural expansion on the discussion publicly, I think is important so that we address the full equation in all of this. I think you talked about public apathy as well. I think sometimes there's apathy. Sometimes it's sort of this notion, prostitution is the oldest profession, et cetera, will always be there. There's nothing you can do about it. It's almost like this fatalistic attitude of, oh, it'll always be, it won't ever change, and therefore we don't need to do anything about it.
Total defeatism.
Defeatism, yeah. And part of it is also, I think maybe some people say, yeah, I agree, it shouldn't happen. And it's hard to hear what happens in prostitution. I think people still sometimes don't have a clue in really the level of violence and that happens in prostitution and in the commercial sex industry. I think that's a challenge as well. I blame this in part because sometimes the conversations have become so sanitized, sex work is work, ideology, etc., that they would like to have this neatly wrapped up, tidied up, that, oh, there's no violence here and we're against exploitation, but sex work is different, etc. And I'm like, for the men, it isn't. The men often don't care whether somebody is there by choice or by force, etc. It's irrelevant sometimes to the men. In fact, some men get off if they notice that there is a level of force and coercion in that as well. I think another part is sometimes people are just not sure what to do about it, right? Even if they realize, okay, this is bad, this isn't good for society, maybe they have some personal connections or they know somebody who's been exploited in the sex trade, I think they just don't know what to do with that information. How do you go from knowing something and having knowledge to action, right? And that's, sometimes it can feel overwhelming for people. Where do I start? But I think that's another challenge as well. And then I think a big part is there's a lot of money to be made in the sex trade, right? I think the incentive, the financial incentive keeps the machine, so to speak, going. And there's always people that benefit from it. And they don't have any interest in changing the landscape for this, right? So who are the benefactors? Who are the people that benefit from it? And I think that's where we have to address that as well. And maybe this goes into the whole conversation around the body rub parlors, massage parlors that are licensed by cities, by municipalities, which in my opinion, now I'm not a lawyer, but in my opinion, violates federal criminal code laws. How are cities allowed to get away with that?
I know.
Do they not know the criminal code? Are they saying it's different and it's separate?
I can tell you that here in Alberta, we're currently in a fight right now, two sides, of course, as it always is, two polarized positions about whether books that are in, I think it's like junior high, like K-9 grades here in Alberta should show explicit sexual depictions. Yeah, I was pretty astounded. So our government of Alberta says, of course, we don't want to show sexually explicit material in books within school areas, school libraries. And I can't even really honestly go on Twitter right now because everything I'm seeing is people arguing that and saying that's stifling free speech. And this is step one of fascism, is banning books. And I'm just dumbfounded at how, I guess, like unmoved or unalarmed people are about how severe this issue is on so many levels and how it's encroaching more and more into youth and into their spaces more and more than we've ever seen. And I think there's so many influences to this. There's been, a slow erosion to many degrees at the family unit, lots of stress, increased poverty because of multiple recessions, neoliberalism, like our economy, especially in Alberta with boom bust with oil and gas. And then a lot of people just not, I think, understanding the big picture and the intercorrelated nature of so many of these things, like we talked about with porn and all this. And I think it really intimidates people because they're just like, where do I start? What do I do? And going back to that question, like, where do you start? Like, what is a main point of focus? And I really think we need all hands on deck and in all these different areas. But it's like there's something stopping people from really caring about this issue. And I just don't really know what that is, what that barrier is. And I notice most of the people that do end up working in this space have been impacted on a personal level by this topic in some way. And I think you're a little bit of an oddity that way, was that you came into it just seeing the injustice. And I know a few others that have as well too. But yeah, I guess, what do you think it's really going to take to reach people? What is the key strategies that we should be doing either on like a social level, a political level, a legal level that's really going to, I guess, reach the masses and do so in an effective way where we're actually going to see some change on a sizable level?
Yeah, good question. Changes come slowly, and these issues are pretty complex. Even the work that you do, Andrea, with having written the book that you have together with Kathy, When Men Buy Sex, I think it's the only one, certainly in a Canadian context, that specifically focused on the issue of men in the sex trade and as buyers, right? Which is one step that you have taken to bring awareness to this issue. All of your activism, all of your, like the podcasts that you're doing here, all of those things, you're reaching people, right? And it may not be in the hundreds of thousands or in the millions of people, but that's, I think, how change starts, is that somebody has an idea, wants to do something, connects with other people, and works together in a collaborative way. It's not always without its challenges, but creates some level of change and awareness and says, I'm not willing to put up with this, and I'm going to do my best in my sphere of influence to push this message. And that's similar to how I see our work here in Winnipeg with the EmpowerMen project, is to create some momentum with these different institutions on these topics. Now, obviously, that has in some ways still a limited reach, but even some of the conversations that we've had with schools, and so we, for example, offer workshops in schools for usually grade 9 to 12, sometimes it's grade 7 to 8 as well, to talk about the issue of sexual exploitation, of trafficking, healthy relationships, gender stereotypes, gender norms, etc. And it's interesting because the feedback that we've gotten from schools is they see the issues and they want some information and they want their students to learn about this. And I think that's one positive thing, is that other people come across it as well, whether it's educators or so, let's say in the school area, and they're willing to do something with it. They just don't know how sometimes, right? They're not the experts on this. They're teachers, they're educators. They don't have a background in this work. So this is where we found, especially over the last year or so, a great interest from schools in this regard. And this comes back to my earlier statement that solutions, I think, have to be local and have to be inspired by survivors and funded by the government, obviously. I think it's one thing for a government to say, yeah, we're dedicated about it. It's another one, okay, are you investing money into it as well? And
Yeah,
not just
the answer is usually no.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
Exactly. And on a more global level, I mean, you were talking about the porn industry and the whole issue here in Canada with Pornhub as one of the main sites worldwide of purveyors of porn and sexual abuse material and sexual exploitation and non-consensual images, etc. And this woman, I don't know if you've ever met her, Layla Mickelwade, right, who wrote about the takedown for Pornhub, right? Like, this is one woman, and I've seen her on podcasts now where she goes on podcasts that reach like literally in the millions of people, and she talks about that aspect, right? And so I think it reaches a certain level of an audience, but in the end, I think the solutions come down to local people and to us on the ground in our communities. You're in Edmonton, and your reach is way beyond Edmonton and Alberta. Those kinds of things, I think, will change slowly. And despite the fact that sometimes the topic seems to be so large and insurmountable, I still think that there is a level of impact that we make, even though we think it's less than what it actually is, And I think it's just not becoming discouraged and sticking together and still believing in it and continuing to move forward with it, And that's why I think even the podcast that you've had, I don't know how long you've been doing it, but I think it's excellent. And you're reaching people from other countries, hopefully, from many countries around the world with your message. And I mean, that's why the internet is so helpful in a lot of ways. It can also really help with spreading the message and getting people activated. And I think there's a part of the population that's apathetic or indifferent to it. But I think a lot of people are not, and they learn something, they want to do something. And so I think we have to reach them. And before coming back to this whole topic around men and men's involvement, I think it has to be men in leadership position who push this forward and who make it a priority, both in terms of sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual exploitation. I mean, we have this big trial going on with these 5 hockey players in Canada that are charged with sexual assault of this one woman. And this is in the media pretty constant now. And I don't know what the outcome of that court case will be if in these big institutions like Hockey Canada, in companies, in the military, in the mining companies, in different spaces where there's male leadership, which is still the case in a lot of circumstances. I think they need to pick up the torch here as well and say, okay, how can I be part of the solution? How can I engage men? And it doesn't mean that you have to become an activist, but you can have conversations and you can make this, somehow integrate this, or have conversations with your male counterparts in that as well. And I think that's where I think the male leadership, I think, has to step in and grow on a political level, on a community level, so that we don't always leave this up to women to make this a priority.
Yeah, thank you.
I think women
are tired.
Yeah, you're tired,
Yeah.
and you've been doing this for collectively for many years and decades, and sometimes even longer than that. And again, this is the issue that I have, is we have to see this as men's issues, both in terms of who's responsible, but also who can do something about it. And it's often men.
And I think men have this interesting way of reaching other men that women don't have. And maybe that's the same for women being able to reach women, maybe in a way that men can't. I'm not sure. But I know I've seen it even in our sex trade offender program. It's not to say that the men don't appreciate my sharing and my insights that I provide them with. I think they do. But like your program, we also have a former exploiter who was a woman buyer for 35 years and very deeply entrenched on the John forums and everything. And it was actually him getting arrested that snapped him out of that cycle, kind of what you talked about, someone needing to do that. And when he gets up and talks to the men at the program, like, it's just such a different dynamic. And I don't know, they just hear him differently and they can relate differently through that male lens. And I also noticed that when male politicians take on this issue, they're really heralded as heroes of community and looked at as good, honorable men making change that's really needed and important. But when women do it, it's like we're labeled as man haters and we're misandrists, or we hate sex. Any of those kind of stereotypes, it's almost like to silence us. And I'm sure that there's parts of it are related on deeper levels of women in leadership. They faced a lot of criticisms that men don't. But yeah, I would like to see more men step up, because I think it is more well received when they are doing it in their positions of leadership than if women are trying to first get in those positions of leadership and then maybe don't want to risk their footing in those places by taking on such a polarizing and hot topic.
That's part of when we created a project here called EmpowerMen. That's even the name is sometimes raising some eyebrows, particularly because of the connection between power and men. But I think the purpose, what we're really trying to communicate, is that men need to and can step up, right? Like, empower men to do better and to speak up, and not to look for sort of the praise for it, but to say, we're coming alongside women and we're willing to do our part. And this is a topic for us as well, right? So that's why we named the program or the project EmpowerMen. And our aim is generally engaging men and boys. I mean, our events and trainings and education is always open to everybody. But coming back to the issue of like law enforcement, you have a lot of law enforcement that are male still. It's still a very male-dominated profession. And so what we do here, like last year, we had the law enforcement conference in March 2024 with a focus on sex buyer accountability, traffickers, but also what can individual police agencies do to address this issue. And we're planning to have another event in November of 2025 to highlight the role of technology, for example, in trafficking and exploitation. Again, the role of men and buyers and traffickers is always an emphasis. And what are police agencies across the country doing, or the justice system, what are they doing to address these kinds of issues? Because the justice system in and of itself has a lot of challenges as well. The other focus that we have for the conference is, how do survivors get supported or not supported through the justice system, right? Like, when they come forward, where they make the statement and they want charges laid, sometimes it's a pretty harrowing experience for somebody to go through that justice system, and often it leaves more people more vulnerable and almost at the risk of being re-exploited. And so I think that's why a lot of people are hesitant. They don't want to necessarily testify. They're afraid of what will happen to me. Will my trafficker come back? Or it's a very public exposure in some ways. So we're really trying to invite experts and professionals in the field, as well as survivors and those who've been impacted to have those conversations as well. And again, push good ideas and good solutions that are happening in some places and really bring people together to create that level of momentum within the criminal justice system.
That's great. I was fortunate to be able to attend last year's conference and do a presentation about our sex trade offender program alongside Kathy King there. And in 12 years now that I've been doing activist work on this, I've attended quite a few conferences, and I have to say that was really the best one out of all of them that I've ever attended was that one. And I can't tell you how many people came up to me or connected with me after through email saying, wow, that was really a mind-shifting conversation, like in all of those different seminars of that event. I'm really looking forward to the one this fall too, Journey to Justice. And I think that's a really beautiful name to really capture, the many different facets of journeying to justice. Like there is that survivor journey, there's the journey of consciousness raising and evolution on a personal level of men in society. There's journeying to justice going through, again, the legal system and getting people to understand how to support women if they're a helping provider. It really, I think, is going to be just a part two of what was really, honestly, a very incredible conference that I think really moved a lot of people. So I'm really glad that you're doing this annual conference, and I hope you don't get burnt out because I know it's so much to plan those types of things. I just come out to Winnipeg, so I'm fortunate, but I know you're doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and it's hard to put on big events like that, big conferences. But I think it's really important, especially since Winnipeg is in the middle of Canada for the most part. It really almost is symbolic of let's all come together in the middle, in the center of it, and really figure out how we can unify across Canada and get people to really walk in the right direction in a unified way.
And sometimes we have a little bit of an inferior complex here in Winnipeg, being in the middle of nowhere, but there's so much good stuff happening and there's so many dedicated people both here and across the country. And I agree with you. I think the feedback that we've gotten for the last one was really good. And I think it was because we had such incredible, diverse people coming together into one space, academics, survivors, police, and obviously people come for the presentations, for the information, but I think equally, and this is tying back to the relational component that you mentioned at the beginning of the interview here, I think people connect on a personal level, and not everybody connects with everybody, and not everybody gets along, we know that. But I think people that are attending, that spend the money and spend the time to come, I think they want to learn and they want to connect and they want to make an impact. And this is what we're aiming for, is to say, what is already happening that is good? Because it's easy sometimes to get discouraged and to get overwhelmed by the sheer size of this issue. And I think everybody needs a little bit of an encouragement and of being in the same room, even if it's just for 2 days, and know that you are not alone. There's other people out there that are doing work, maybe in a different profession, maybe in a different city in Canada, but that there's this level of connection, I think, that we have, that we share because it's the same values or a similar goal that we're trying to move towards. And that's why I think these events are so important and in a lot of ways uplifting, despite the heavy topic of it. And so this is what we're really aiming to do again for this one in November.
Yeah, whenever I got home from the last one, I'm not even joking, for 3 or 4 days, I rode this high of encouragement and support and was like,
exactly,
I was actually sad whenever I left. I was like, I really wish all the people that were at that conference could all live in the same city, all work for the same company, but really move this all forward, because wow, we'd be this unstoppable freight train. But then it's, of course, you're like, I'm grateful that person's out east and that person's out west, and that there's little strains of our group off to the edges, tackling it in different areas.
Yeah.
And then EmpowerMen also is spearheading a fairly new initiative as well that I want to touch on briefly, which is Demand Action Coalition, which I think is also a really incredible new thing going on in Canada in the abolitionist space.
Yeah, so the group that came together was born out of the organizing committee for the first conference, even for this conference here. And what we had initially done was to connect with people across the country who work in the space of addressing sexual exploitation and trafficking from a demand side. So we had reached out, we had collected all of the information for the either prostitution offender programs or other agencies that we knew were working in this field. And we brought people together. Again, the technology makes this so easy now, whether you live in different parts of the country. And what we're really wanting to do is to not just meet and organize this conference, but also how can we stay connected when it comes to addressing exploitation and trafficking and the issue of prostitution through different ways. And one of the focus points that the Med Action Coalition is working towards or expanding is the whole issue of addressing the licensing regimes, the body rub massage parlor licenses that different cities across the country are still handing out, they are charging money from women or those who work in these establishments to charge the establishments. And in some ways, I think this is, again, coming back to my earlier point, I'm pretty sure that it's in violation of the criminal code. But I think what it also does is it legitimizes it as a business, right? And essentially, my previous executive director for the organization that we're with here, the Mamawi Center, she essentially said that cities become pimps if they take money from women that are in the sex trade or in these establishments, right?
Yeah, Reem Al-Salam at the UN said the same thing too. Pimp states, as she called them in her really groundbreaking report of 2024.
Yeah. And again, we're in the process of exploring how can we address this? How can we challenge that? How can we provide information? How can we engage with city officials? Obviously, it's a municipality issue. So each city council votes on these kinds of licenses backed up or supported by city officials or by the administrative branches of the different municipalities. We just want to continue those conversations and maybe identifying a couple of cities across the country, maybe Alberta and Ontario, single cities, to say, how can we get some traction? And there's a couple of examples across country where the city council has stopped giving out licenses. Winnipeg is one of them. I think was one of the first ones. I think together
About
with
2 years ago.
Yeah,
Two
about
years
2
ago or
years ago.
something?
Yeah, together with Newmarket, Ontario. So there's a couple of places where they said, we don't feel comfortable with this anymore. It's always an uphill battle, but we have to start somewhere. And again, it's bringing people together who either have the knowledge, the experience, and the connection, sometimes political connections, that are helpful in driving these conversations forward. Because at the end of the day, all of these decisions are made by individual people, often as a group in a city council. So it's working the system in a way where we try to convince with solid information, with facts, to say, hey, you should really consider whether you should continue to give out these licenses and charge people for it. There could be done a lot more, but we're keen to do that. And because we have the luxury or the beautiful part that there's different folks from different parts of the country. So we were connected to what's happening in our local city, and we can bring people together that are willing to say, hey, our city council is doing this. Why don't we approach it from this way? And that's one of the areas that we want to continue to work on. And the other one is also, again, coming back to PSEPA and the prostitution laws, to say, how can we expand training, education for people within the justice system and criminal justice system as well.
There's so many things to tackle, and I think you just don't sleep at night, honestly, because
sometimes I don't. I wake up at 3:00 in the morning and I have a million thoughts running through my head.
Oh my gosh, I've done that too. I wake up and I grab my phone and I'm on the notepad, the note apps, or the notepad app. And
I just want to say, I'm not doing this work alone by any stretch of the imagination. There's so many people involved in this. I have an excellent team. I have an excellent support, both from an administrative side, as well as the staff that I work with here and that I get to lead, as well as all of the members of the committee. I know we were talking about finances earlier and resourcing, and we're appreciative of the funding that we've received, both from different departments, different government levels, for us to be able to do this kind of work. And that's where we're really grateful for all of the support and the willingness for different folks to step in different ways, right? Whether it's time, it's commitment, it's doing research, it's reaching out to somebody, it's making connections, the financial aspect. And obviously you're a big part of that group as well, right? At the end of the day, it comes down to people taking initiative, being committed. That's the pleasure of having a group like that, because you feel that this is really a group effort, and it's a lot easier to do this together than it is in your own little corner of the world.
That's true. And I think that's a really nice way to wrap up. And I think it goes back to saying what you said about everyone just working with what they got in the area that they're in, on that local, smaller level, and finding the ways that your strengths and your skills can support the movement in a larger sense. And just getting involved in some kind of way. And I think people kind of think, well, if this hasn't impacted me, or if I just don't watch porn, so I'm not part of the problem, then I really don't need to feel compelled to be part of the solution. But I think we can all, for the most part, maybe not all of us, but some of us who have seen some of the darkness of it, I think we can appreciate how beautiful it could be to have a world where we have genuine equality and we don't have a commercial sex industry that really serves to divide us on a personal level from ourselves, but also communities and others in our lives. So I really want to thank you, Hennes, for all the work that you do, and once again for the support that you show so many other people in this movement, particularly survivors and exited individuals, men and women alike. And yeah, I look forward to just continuing doing the work with you. And every time that we get to collaborate on something, it's really quite rewarding for me. And I think that's true for so many people who have experienced sexual exploitation, is that when you see men in this movement and they're genuine, good, heart-centered men with collective consciousness, it really helps to fuel us as people who have lived in that world and have really suffered at the hands of a lot of men and had that impact our view of men, however that happens. So I just really want to thank you once again. And if people want to connect with you on a more meaningful level or get involved, maybe with the work of EmpowerMen, anything that you got going on, the conference and all of that, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way is just to reach out to us through our website. It is empowermen.ca, so EmpowerMen.ca. All of the information, our contact information is on there, my contact info. If somebody's interested in learning more about our youth work and the workshops that we do in schools and youth agencies, we have two great facilitators, Alexis and Chris, who do this kind of work here, mostly in Manitoba, because that's where we're based out of. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. We'll have the information for the conference up on our website shortly as well. So the dates are 25th and 26th of November here in Winnipeg. So that will go up very soon. And we're also launching the website for the DAC, the Demand Action Coalition, shortly. Check the website, empowermen.ca, and you'll find the information.
Great. Lots going on. I look forward to what the future brings. Yeah.
And again, thanks to you, Andrea, for your tireless work. I know you're busy at home as well with a lot of different things. So always a pleasure to connect with you. And if we cheer each other on and support each other, there's lots of good things we can accomplish and that we already have accomplished. And I think it's good to be reminded of that. There's people out there that care, right? We may not be the majority, but sometimes we just need to find the right people to do this kind of work with.
That's right. I appreciate that. Thanks again, Hennes.
Okay, thank you.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.